My wife's sister convinced her to pretend she wanted a divorce as a wake-up call to make me a better husband. Their scheme completely backfired when I hired a lawyer and filed the papers myself. I'm 34 years old and have been married to my wife Rachel for 5 years. We've been living in our house for the past 2 years and I genuinely believed we had built something lasting together. We managed our finances jointly, shared household duties, and had developed this steady rhythm that worked for both of us. Sure, we weren't newlyweds anymore sending each other romantic texts every hour, but I considered us a stable, mature married couple working toward our long-term goals together. What I didn't know is that Rachel had been complaining to her older sister Linda about feeling like our marriage had become too routine. Linda, who's been through 2 divorces herself, apparently convinced Rachel that I was taking her for granted and that she needed to create some drama to wake me up and make me a more attentive husband. About 10 weeks ago, Rachel started acting completely unlike herself. She began making remarks about how she felt unfulfilled in our marriage and questioning whether we'd gotten married too young. At first, I thought she might be going through some kind of midlife crisis, so I tried to be supportive and give her room to express whatever she was feeling. But then she started talking about how she regretted not staying single longer and wasn't sure if she was cut out for married life. She said she'd been reflecting on her choices and wondering if settling down at 29 had been a mistake. She mentioned feeling like she'd lost her identity and independence, and that our marriage felt more like a business arrangement than a romantic partnership. I was completely blindsided but tried to stay calm. I told her I wanted to understand what she was going through and that we could work together to address whatever was making her unhappy. I suggested we could try new activities together, plan some romantic getaways, or even see a marriage counselor if she felt we needed professional help. During this conversation, she was emotional and kept saying how much she loved me but that she'd been feeling trapped in our domestic routine and needed to rediscover who she was as an individual. She talked about possibly separating for a while and suggested we consider a trial separation to give her time to figure out what she really wanted from life and marriage. She even provided specific examples of how she felt our relationship had become stagnant and predictable. Rachel said she missed the excitement of dating and the thrill of not knowing what each day would bring. She mentioned that Linda had been pointing out how different she seemed now compared to when she was single, and how marriage had supposedly dulled her personality and ambitions. I spent the next 2 months in absolute emotional turmoil. I started researching divorce lawyers since she seemed serious about separation and I wanted to understand my options. I had to explain to my parents that Rachel and I were having serious problems, which was mortifying because they'd been asking when we might start thinking about having children. My father was particularly concerned and kept offering to talk to Rachel himself because he could see how destroyed I was. My mother suggested we stay with them for a while if we needed space from each other, and my brother awkwardly tried to give me advice about how sometimes marriages go through rough patches. The whole experience was humiliating because I'd been so proud of our marriage that I'd often bragged to friends about how well we worked together. The worst part was how Rachel seemed to be thriving during this supposed marital crisis. She was spending more time with Linda and her divorced friends, posting photos of herself at wine bars and spa days I'd never heard of, and generally appearing to enjoy this new version of herself. Meanwhile, I was losing sleep and couldn't concentrate at work because I kept wondering if the woman I'd vowed to spend my life with was about to ask for a divorce. I started having panic attacks about our future and had to start seeing a therapist to deal with the anxiety. My colleagues noticed that I seemed stressed and distracted all the time. My manager even suggested I'd take some personal time because my work quality had clearly suffered. I felt like I was living in a nightmare, unable to think about anything except the possibility that my marriage was falling apart. Rachel would have deep conversations with me occasionally during this period, sending mixed messages about loving me but also talking about how liberating it felt to consider other life paths. She'd say things like, "I'm starting to remember who I used to be before we got married and maybe this crisis will help us both grow as individuals." These conversations would give me hope for a few days, but then she'd go out with Linda again and come back talking about independence and self-discovery. I found myself constantly analyzing her behavior and mood for signs of what she was really thinking. When she seemed happy after spending time with her sister, I'd wonder if Linda was encouraging her to leave me. When she was affectionate toward me, I'd hope it meant she was reconsidering the separation. The emotional roller coaster was exhausting and affecting every aspect of my life. After about 2 months of this agony, I'd started accepting that our marriage might actually be over. I'd even consulted with a divorce attorney, not because I wanted to end things, but because I needed to understand what separation would look like financially and legally. Then Linda's ex-husband Mark called me completely drunk one evening, rambling about how impressed he was with Linda for finally teaching Rachel how to handle a husband and how their strategy was working perfectly because I was finally acting like a man who might lose something important. I had no idea what he was talking about, so I pressed him for details. That's when Mark revealed that the entire marriage crisis was completely fake. Linda had convinced Rachel that the best way to get me to be a more romantic and attentive husband was to make me think our marriage was in jeopardy. They'd planned out what Rachel should say to make it seem like she was having genuine doubts about our future together. According to Mark, Linda had been orchestrating this marriage intervention for months after Rachel mentioned feeling like our relationship had become too comfortable. Linda convinced Rachel that comfortable marriages often lead to husbands becoming lazy and unappreciative, so they needed to create urgency to motivate me toward being a better partner. Mark drunkenly confessed that Linda had been monitoring my behavior through Rachel and celebrating every sign that I was becoming more desperate to save our marriage. They thought it was hilarious that I'd started bringing Rachel flowers randomly and planning surprise date nights to try to prove my commitment. I hung up on Mark and sat in my garage for hours, trying to process what I'd just learned. When Rachel came home that night, I confronted her with what Mark had told me. She immediately started crying and admitted everything. She said it had started as a simple plan to motivate me toward being more romantic, but it had escalated into something much more serious than she'd intended. Rachel explained that Linda had convinced her that our marriage was getting stale and that I was taking her for granted. Linda told her that comfortable marriages often lead to husbands becoming complacent because they're getting all the benefits of marriage without having to work for them. The fake crisis was supposed to create urgency and make me realize I needed to step up as a husband before I lost her. She apologized endlessly and said she never meant for it to go on so long or cause me so much pain. She claimed she'd been planning to end the charade soon and that she was actually ready to work on our marriage because the fake crisis had made her realize how much she loved being married to me. But I was absolutely furious. I told her that instead of motivating me to be a better husband, she'd actually accomplished the opposite. I couldn't believe that someone who'd promised to love and honor me would put me through months of emotional torture just to test how much effort I'd put into our marriage. If she wanted more romance, she could have simply talked to me about it instead of creating an elaborate deception. The more I thought about it, the more betrayed I felt. I realized that every conversation we'd had during those months had been based on lies. When she'd cried about feeling trapped, she was acting. When she'd talked about needing independence, she was following Linda's script. When she'd said she regretted getting married young, she was deliberately trying to hurt me to get the reaction Linda wanted. I thought about all the sleepless nights I'd spent wondering what I'd done wrong in our marriage, all the self-doubt I'd experienced about whether I was good enough for her, all the anxiety I'd felt about our future together. She'd watched me go through all of that emotional turmoil while knowing it was completely manufactured for her entertainment and Linda's approval. Rachel kept insisting that Linda had convinced her it was the only way to get through to me and that she'd been wrong to listen to her sister. She begged me to understand that everything she'd done was because she loved me and wanted us to have a stronger marriage. She said the plan had backfired because she'd realized during our fake crisis that she didn't actually want independence at all. She even tried to turn the situation around on me, saying that if I really loved her, I'd be able to forgive one mistake and that my willingness to throw away 5 years of marriage over this proved that maybe I wasn't as committed to our vows as I claimed to be. This manipulation attempt only made me angrier because it showed she still didn't understand the fundamental problem with what she'd done. I told her that the trust between us was completely destroyed and that I couldn't imagine staying married to someone who thought emotional manipulation was an appropriate way to improve our relationship. She'd spent months watching me suffer and worry about our future while knowing the entire crisis was manufactured. That level of deception wasn't something I could just forgive and move forward from. Rachel promised she'd never listen to Linda again and suggested we try marriage counseling to work through the trust issues. But I'd already made up my mind. I told her that I was done with the marriage and that she'd gotten her wish for independence, just not in the way she'd planned. Over the next few days, Linda and her divorced friends started calling me to defend their actions and convince me to forgive Rachel. Linda insisted that they'd only been trying to help Rachel get what she wanted and that their plan had actually worked because I'd shown how much I valued our marriage. Her friend Michelle told me I was being unreasonable and that Rachel had learned her lesson about listening to bad advice. But their phone calls only made things worse because they revealed more details about how calculated the entire scheme had been. Linda mentioned that they'd been planning this intervention for months and had researched different strategies online before settling on the fake marriage crisis approach. Michelle admitted that they'd been tracking my responses and adjusting Rachel's behavior based on how I reacted to different triggers. The most disturbing revelation came from Linda herself, who called to apologize but ended up making things worse by explaining how much thought they'd put into psychological manipulation. She said they'd studied articles about marriage dynamics and male psychology to make their plan more effective. They'd specifically chosen the timing of Rachel's supposed crisis to coincide with the stress of a big project at work because they thought it would make me more desperate to resolve things quickly. But the more I reflected on it, the angrier I became. These women had treated my emotions like a game.